just a second until I know that we're live. Come on, YouTube. Show me stuff. Nice. Okay, so hi everyone to another live session, Q&A session slash week 3 and 4 session that we're going to have. We will be covering a bunch of interesting stuff today, and the official agenda would be first go through a couple of questions from the tests from week 1, because some of the people expressed their desire to know the right answers. We'll go through most of the stuff that I remember people were struggling with, um, to make sure that everyone's on the same page and not feel left out. Then we'll go and look at some pull requests that randomly were selected from people who actually did go through crosscheck to see how they're doing. Again, no bias. We're randomly selecting people every time we do crosscheck review. The main objective for that is to see how would a person who has already experience with AWS and writing some Node.js code would look at configuration and stuff that we are teaching you guys do. We'll look at the code of one person a bit more closely to discuss a particular topic that I personally want to bring up once I saw that in the code of some other people. And then we'll finish today's session, hopefully either with questions from people. At the moment, we see that it's not really popular stream, but hopefully it will change. We will discuss before that what it is that you need to know regarding the third task on the course with API Gateway and Lambda interactions. But first, let's start the first one. First topic for today is the discussion of the test. So there were a bunch of questions that were not necessarily counted to towards the mark. It's just for analytics. So that's for those who are wondering that why there are no correct answers in that. Then I know that some of you struggle with a question that require a bit of experience and a bit more understanding of what IAM is than just abbreviation or the primary goal of the service. And for example, the question was, let me just find it real quick. This one. What are the ways to configure IAM and remove change resource objects? Going forward with your understanding of how AWS works, you know that under the hood, the like backbone technical implementation relies heavily on API requests. Those API requests are unified across the offering, and by offering I mean AWS as a public cloud or as a cloud provider. The way that end users access that public offering can vary, but again, it all comes down to the same API request going from either AWS Managed Console, which is a UI of your AWS cloud, command line tools, CLI, for example, AWS CLI. It also creates, based on your user input, creates requests to the same AWS cloud. Same with AWS SDKs, and yeah, finally, IAM HTTPS API. Nothing specific about IAM. In this regards, every resource relies on some kind of API infrastructure, which comes down to a distributed nature of different services that they are building and the granularity that they allow users to have. And that distribution relies on a medium to communicate between each other. And you can think of users outside of AWS infrastructure as just um, entities that communicate through the same medium with AWS Cloud. Um, then we had this question that strangely were not 100% people answered correctly. What is an IAM group? An IAM group is nothing more than a logical construct that bundles a bunch of IAM users together and applies same policies. Why are we doing that? So that we don't repeat um, policy application for every single user. We know policies are just JSON objects. Again, one of the questions that you will manage to get almost 100% right. And those JSON objects, copied and pasted them on different users and they are applied there. Like not necessarily copied and pasted, but they still need to be applied to every user. Um, then also groups are just logical entity that does almost the same thing, and it just bundles a bunch of users together and they inherit their policy. Okay, so I had some questions in live streaming. Okay, let's go. Okay. Um, then finally, I think the hardest question among all the questions that we gave you guys to kind of think about was what is a root account? Um, One thing to say is that it's not really surprising because a root account requires you to think more about it every time you deal with it. So root account is actually the one that is automatically created when you create your AWS account. And this root account, you can think of it as any other account and any other service that you create. Um, Facebook account, same bank account, again, the same thing. It's just that AWS provides you with a service that allows a more granular approach to permissions. And one of them is divide your root account access level into into kind of hierarchy of things, like creating additional user accounts with limited set of permission. But root account is essentially the main, is the one that is going to pay the bills, and it's you can think of it as a small company having a root account on the company level, and any people who join the company to work for it will have some kind of user account, not root account. And that small business will attach their accounting department sheets to the same billing logic. And that's how we work. In a larger organization, we already discussed that. You have AWS organizations, coincidentally, which is just a hierarchy of root accounts. So imagine like a separate account in AWS with its own root account. The only purpose of that account is to manage other root accounts across organizations. So every department will have a root account, or shortly saying AWS account, which is almost the same thing. And all the people inside of that department will have their own resources and their own users that create those resources. That AWS organization level account would not have any resources except the ones that are necessary to control this hierarchy. That's the entire thing. So all in all, account has the most privileges, like there is full privileges, and it is automatically created as any other account. Some of the people did not tick this when they ticked the admin privileges, which is not necessarily um, straightforward for me personally. But again, yeah, just remember, like automatically created account is the same as root account. So that's that. So hopefully that clears the question regarding your tests. Okay, and going back, let's review what we needed to have done in the practical task two. And for that, I'll check the questions if there are any. Okay, we still have just two people. What a sad thing. Anyways, hopefully those who rewatch it in a more convenient time would find it interesting. So, um, task two and module two was all about serving some kind of static file um, from an S3 bucket through CloudFront and out into the wild. And the gist of the task was to have an S3 as a URL, not accessible from the outside world, but the CloudFront URL available from the outside world. Um, as with everything in a cloud or infrastructure, you can do that manually, which is frowned upon, and you can do that automatically with something called infrastructure as code. In our case, infrastructure as code that we are using in this program is serverless framework. So you literally had to do two things, uh, which is serve your website twice, basically. One with manual, the other one with automatic deployment. And yeah, task three was just an organizational thing to do, so we're just thinking in this regard. So when it comes to manual deployment, it is literally just dragging and dropping your um, static files into an S3 bucket. So I don't have access to any of your AWS accounts, so I can't do that and check that people actually follow that. So it's up to you. Um, and then creating a CloudFront distribution to look at that bucket and playing with a bunch of permissions. Compare that to automated deployment, more easily understandable in terms of set of things that you need to do. In time, you'll be more familiar with that. Again, we provided you with a bunch of pre-configured things that are doing that, and you all you had to do is to switch to these two plugins to kind of finish the work. Okay. So let's look at the first pull request that I randomly picked. There's no description, which is a bit confusing for me personally. Hopefully, this person updated the README. Let's see the files. Again, yeah, and immediately we see that there is a README with both of the links, one for CloudFront and one for S3 bucket. Immediately from my own experience and from the task itself, I know that this link should not be accessible with something like 403 or 404, some access denied thing, and this one should actually lead to the website. In the real world, what I would also do is use a Route 53 service to map this link to a more readable um, uh, website URL that we are all used to, something to like github.com or better github.com instead of this. It's already more easy to kind of share this link instead of sharing an S3 link, but just be aware of like a typical flow would be to um, map it back to Route 53. Okay, let's see. Maybe the people doing something here. Not necessarily. Let me just mute it for a while. So, continuing with the pull request, I can see that there are a bunch of files, not many of them, just 4, which is nice. In terms of it's easy to read. It's not 5,000 files for some people who committed uh, stuff that should be ignored usually, which is good. We're using Serverless Finch. Nice, a correct version of that, latest version. I assume that's because Serverless was actually complaining about that. Okay. Uh, Again, a very understandable thing. Serverless people who do keep track of the versioning, and as far as I know, they introduced some breaking changes there, but overall code should work fine. Updated Node.js, cool. A new bucket name. Strangely enough, shop dot dash rs dot dash app, sorry, um, is unique enough for S3, which is really surprising. It's a variable. I see. But yes, still you're not remapping it to S3. Be aware that yeah, names of the bucket should be unique across the globe, um, which is counterintuitive because it should be mapped to your own account. But again, I already explained that it's a historical reason to have that, and that's one of the reason why we're doing or why we're able to access those links worldwide because of the unique names. So let's check. So predictably, that's a bad request, incorrect endpoint or something. Surprising. I thought that would be an access denied thing, but okay. Maybe there are some issues with permissions. Could be, or maybe you've already deleted that bucket. Strange. But anyway, let's hope that the distribution actually works. It seems that we immediately have some distributions working, and I can confirm by the by the looks of it, it's a correct thing. And let's just check the network to see more details of that. Okay, some card requests that is failing at the moment, which is okay, I assume. And let's further explore what we are end up receiving from front end sites. Okay, okay, so that is the main thing, and it just shares the static file. Okay, and it seems like pictures are auto-generated as well. Let's see the response headers. We can clearly see um, that we're serving a CloudFront, so and it's a cache miss because that's a separate thing to serve a file with cache enabled. Also, what interesting is I can see that it's actually an Amazon S3 that is serving that, not some kind of EC2 instance. Some useful information regarding some e-tags for me to check against if I'm trying to see if that's a valid payload that I'm receiving, but that's a bit more into security. Uh, Amazon CF ID might be, so it's a CloudFront ID. Could be an ID that's internally CloudFront uses. Anything else from here? That's my stuff. Okay, everything seems to be working. Let's wrap up. Yeah, the code works great. Seems like a person was really um, concise in terms of how much code they write, and yeah, that is a valid solution. And I can see that some of the stuff was already introduced there. And yeah, we can have an S3 bucket, and we're using the same bucket name there. Okay, bucket policy is set up by default. That's also fine. At least you end up working with serverless and creating about actual deployment. And I assume, which is how it's supposed to work, I assume we will end up creating a cloud formation stack to serve all the files. And we outputting a bunch of things in that stack. Okay, cool. Next one. Let's see. Oh, let me. Okay, yeah. Let me just think for a moment. I think I saw some code. Yeah, let's start with this one. So, immediately what I can tell, yeah, updated the get ignore, which is cool. And then a README contains the link, and that's just a link to S3 bucket. Okay, let's see what's inside the conversation. We have S3 bucket and the CloudFront URL. Let's immediately check them uh, if we get any errors. Okay. Oh, uh, that is exactly what I was referring to, which is a more predictable error in this case. I don't have access to this URL per se because I'm an outsider from the perspective of the S3 bucket. And that could be done on several different layers inside S3 bucket in terms of um, access control list, bucket policy, or any other layers of protecting the website, even the bucket policy at the very top of the bucket itself. Or that could be an object related permission issue. But that's like all it comes to is that it's a forbidden resource, and that's a more predictable way for me to say that. Okay, let's check the CloudFront. Nice. Everything seems to work. Let's check network for exactly the same reason why they did that in the first place. I want to see headers, incoming headers. So again, S3 bucket as a server, that's fine. Okay, head from CloudFront. Okay, let's refresh that a couple of times. Okay, and then this one. Okay, 304. It's a hit. So as you can see, CloudFront is not only able to serve your files, but is also a cache layer, which is exactly why we use DNS in the first place. Okay, cool. Let's look at the code now. So getignore is really good. Thank you for that. Um, let's see. Deploy S3 as serverless client deploy. And I assume what you're trying to do here um, is specify exactly what you want to do. Let's see if that's a Googleable thing. Um, you're mapping to a specific folder, which is fine, especially with a bunch of stuff that is usually going on um, in different projects. Why am I making focus on that, or why I'm paying attention? Is that usually we don't do that much mapping. We tend to run serverless from the same folder where we have a serverless.yaml, and the resources that we're deploying, again, they rely um, on the nesting at the root of um, your structure to have serverless file, and all the rest is related or relative to serverless, if that makes sense. Um, with serverless stuff, we usually building less cumbersome project, so it's nothing like a monolith. Sorry, my brain frizzed for a second. Um, so that means serverless things should be lightweight, and we usually do keep them lightweight. So just be mindful in terms of what to use when you doing AWS. Serverless primary goal is to have that separation um, with regards to this is only for serverless resources and serverless stuff. Side note, that's not a problem. That's just a not typical thing to have. So you're relying on serverless providing you with a way of specifying the folder, which is not the case for the cases when you have CI/CD jungling with your files from place to place. Okay, serverless, yeah, it should bump to 3, I think, at this point already. Yeah, and a bunch of leftover stuff. Um, that could be removed essentially. Auto-generated things from serverless itself could be removed. That would be easier for people to read your code because immediately, compared to the previous pull request, what I see is a bunch of changed lines, and I might miss the actual change that you applied here. And again, I want to see where you use that bucket name. I would have to actually search for that. Okay, you deleted that line. You deleted this. And then what else? A lot of deletions, commented stuff. So as you can see, for me, that would be a bit harder to read necessarily. So make sure that you are actually doing stuff like deleting comments. Let's see the raw file. Yeah, a bunch of things. We are just using client distribution folder build. Okay, you're serving directly from the same folder from build. Okay, that's fine. And a lot of commented code. Um, one one issue I would have with that is that you're relying on pre-building your project before you serve, which is not necessarily um, kind of the way to go. You might include that into your build process. So that distribution folder might be um, named differently, for example. So you want to rely on your stuff being kind of automated. So you want to have npm, I don't know, npm run deploy to S3 as you did with that, and it should just build your project from React, place it in a folder, get the name of that folder, give it to um, serverless, for example, to serve from, something like that. But yeah, since job is done, that's okay. Going forward, you will have harder time when you don't have, or we have a bigger delivery or bigger build process in order to achieve that. So always try to keep serverless as the central source of truth, sort of, for your app. And again, since you're using one of the plugins, they apply some um, additional limitations, and we usually tend to be more explicit in terms of infrastructure and like in anything in code when it comes to like configurations. So what I would have is some kind of a default serverless Finch in your configuration here, which is one of the optional points in the task itself where you actually provide um, configuration files. Let me see. Configuration. Yeah, configured. So those two plugins should be explicitly configured for you to have. They are designed in a way that they work out of the box, but you never rely on that in production. Again, too easy to break. Okay, the rest, let's see, they changed something in the main layout. You probably used your name for that, which is completely fine. It's your code. So be happy or be proud of what you build, essentially. All right, so we're going to the next one. Let's see. So a bunch of files again. Get ignore something new. I don't really know, to my uh, sadness. I don't really know what is GSPM, GSPM, and something dip. JavaScript package manager. Okay, for system.js. That's some old stuff. I'm too young for this. Okay, never mind. Jokes aside, let's look at the actual links. This person also provided a bunch of links and deleted the default create React app stuff here. Oh, okay, I see. You're using yarn. Okay, that makes sense. Why, this is here. Okay. Let's check the links. 403, expected. Again, access denied. What I would expect from this. Let's see. CloudFront. I expect this to work. And again, um, if I were to be fast enough to open DevTools before I have a first hit, we would actually be able to see that we didn't hit the CloudFront cache. Sorry. But it's already 304, which is a cache hit, refresh hit from CloudFront. Okay, interesting wording here. Let's see if we get anything else from CloudFront. Yeah, miss. Okay, something funky. But anyways, my idea was to show you that a lot of stuff coming from AWS and a lot of useful information when debugging stuff in AWS you can get from their response headers. They even say what kind of server that they use under the hood. And again, if you do proper production work, you will probably have some kind of solution either at the DNS level or the proxy level in your infrastructure, or even at the express level that just hides stuff, something like Helmet, um, which is, yeah, just a security requirement, because there is a lot of stuff you can read from default headers that AWS sends for you. By the way, speaking of that, let's try to see what we see when we get a forbidden error from AWS, which is also an interesting thing to do. Let's see. When I make a request, I literally go with get requests. Okay. Request headers, nothing interesting. Host, okay. Amazon, and we get a response. Yeah, it's an HTML response. Okay, I get it. But sometimes when you can't access something, um, they will provide you with a header specifying like a code that you can just Google, and some kind of documentation will pop up saying that what you're actually doing wrong. So yeah, being mindful of headers. Okay, let's go further. So we have index HTML. Okay, that's good stuff. We bumped up the version through to the modern things. We have an eject. Ага, не знаю, что... Sorry for Russian, but yeah. I would hope that this is something nice in Russian. Um, Again, we have S3, which is done. Cool. Let's tick that. And this is the point that I wanted to kind of make a bit more clear for anyone doing that, so going forward for that person specifically. What we see here is a separate folder for that single page app plugin that is all about, sorry, that is all about configuring something. Let's look at the documentation of this plugin. So let's hopefully I can just select that. Let's look at the docs, what they say. Explore that for a bit. Single page application plugin for serverless. Simplify deploying single page application to F3 and CloudFront. It's like exactly what we're doing here. You install that, you connect that to serverless, and then you point to the build folder essentially, and finally add appropriately named resources. Yeah, we kind of have everything here. Um, we just, yeah, it seems like a very popular plugin that based on the official examples, auto-generated bucket name. Okay, that's useful. Multiple independent deployments, package its own repo so it can be reused in independent version. Also cool, and they come with okay, and they come um, with an actual code. Um, cool. So what you see is how you would get to work with actual serverless custom plugins. Um, Serverless single page app plugin is not a custom one. You install that into your project. So then you kind of configure your serverless YAML to use that uh, here. And you expect that just by installing it to your project and plugging it into serverless YAML and doing some minimal configuration, any plugin would actually work fine. That is the way it should be. When it comes to writing your own plugins, um, the only thing you need to do is to follow certain criteria that serverless as a framework provides you with. Um, okay, it doesn't have invalid cache feature. Yeah, so you just follow a certain number of rules that serverless framework applies in order to consider any code that you want to a plugin. And that set of rules can be boiled down to having some kind of constructor. That's cool. Run AWS command. So as you can see, that one method, then method two, and then domain info. So a bunch of stuff would be required for your plugin to successfully plug in, pun intended, into your serverless framework. What those functions, so existence of that function is required, but what those functions would actually do will depend on what you're trying to achieve. So if you think about it, in the constructor, you can hook up a lot of stuff, custom stuff that it's not required for serverless framework per se, but is a requirement for you to do. And that's how we build custom resources, hint, hint, in CloudFormation. We just following a certain rules that CloudFormation custom plugins or serverless custom plugins do in order to build our custom stuff. And by custom, I mean not everything could be covered with default infrastructure as code that we see serverless is using. So, okay, this one, I'm not sure why we have these files here because it feels like it should be just in a non-modules folder, but maybe that's because of that strange thing with yarn and JS npm something. Okay, it's just a very interesting thing. So going forward, at some point, you will come up, you will encounter stuff in your experience, that will require you to write your own custom plugins that might be doing nothing more than just running a bunch of CLI commands at the point of creation or deletion. Yeah, just know that most of the infrastructure as code tools, if if they don't support stuff pre-written, give them pre-written to you, you can essentially write your own, giving their API. Okay, let's see what else we have here. So again, a bunch of commented code, which is not ideal. I would delete that personally. Some remapping from the build folder. Again, I assume that was a default, so whoever is watching and taking that into their own um, account, um, yeah, since it's a default, I guess it was just an additional information for you to know about going forward. Nothing personal. Again, keep in mind deleting a bunch of commented code is always a plus to make your code less cluttered, but seems like everything else stayed the same. We're creating um, a bucket, okay, and everything else stayed the same. So yeah, um, what about the rest? Typescript best practices, I assume, which is a joke. Yeah, be mindful that if you start using TypeScript within your project, just um, be sure to continue with its best practices in defining types. Thank you for a purchase. You're welcome. Again, TypeScript, I would change that to something more meaningful. Strict from true to false to make life a bit less miserable. Overall, as you can see, the first task was just a bunch of plugins working together or default code that we provided you with. But going forward, this experience working with serverless hopefully will be beneficial to you. And I think that's enough for the um, code review. Let's see, do we have any questions? I have a question about public access in F3. Why we enable public access by checkbox but denied by 403 with policy? What does mean miss from CloudFront? A miss from CloudFront means a cache hit miss. It's just the jargon that we use with cache solutions. So, for example, a cache hit would be I made a request. That request didn't go through the cache layer all the way to my actual server. It kind of hit the cache layer, and cache responded with cached content. A cache miss, it's either the first ever made request to that cache and particular endpoint, which would go essentially through the cache because there's no such content yet. And then going back from that endpoint, it will just cache that. So um, so that the next time it will be a cache hit. So hit is you get cached content, miss you go through the cache layer all the way to your website or something. I have a question about public access in S3, why we enable public access by checkbox but denied by 403 with policies. It all comes down to the fact that mm, we're not always serving just websites with S3. If you remember from the S3 um, theory, S3 is just an object storage. So providing a nice response from the perspective of APIs with correct status codes and expected output is still a best practice and it applied to S3. That's one reason. A second reason would be, again, historical. There's a layer of things that we do when it comes to policies. And that checkbox that I think you're mentioning is the very top checkbox, which is bucket policy checkbox when creating a bucket. Um, and that is um, the way that AWS solved the problem that, hey, S3 access is a really pain in the ass when it comes to managing it. Let's just have the easiest possible way to turn off all the permissions, and that's how they created this public thing. So if I were to change my bucket public access policy just by hitting this one small button, I not only hit all four of these, but also deny the rest of the stuff that I might have configured at the ACL level. So that's it. Block all for easy access, and 403 with granular control of what is outputted there. It's either by AWS or you for compatibility with other API and yeah standards and all that. And it gives you information, don't you think? Okay. So what is left for us to discuss is your next task, which is um, task 3. Let's see. As I already mentioned, task 3 will completely be like about Lambda functions and API gateways, not in depth, but just an introduction. Um, so what I would suggest for you to do is understand why we have um, Lambda functions and think about the ways that we can use it. So it's not only uh, for accessing or building different handlers for API gateway as endpoints, as we usually do with Express. It's just a code that could be invoked by various different means. So by HTTP requests coming from API gateway, by HTTP requests coming not from the API gateway, by some event in your pipeline, for example, as a response to a new stuff added to DynamoDB. So various different use cases for Lambda. Uh, and API gateway is nothing more than just a front-facing thing that could remap incoming request somewhere else. One of the remapping destination for API gateway would be a Lambda. So that would be it. Um, in terms of uh, what it what it boils down to when it comes to building stuff with serverless in mind and API gateway and Lambda, um, we come to the actual serverless framework. Main goal is like when those guys sit down and try to simplify the process of not writing CloudFormation code with a lot of details like here and there, um, they they kind of understood that for people coming with little to no AWS knowledge, writing raw CloudFront thing would be too much. So they end up creating a layer on top of that that with a specific syntax again to build CloudFormation. And uh, the target audience were for them was serverless people who, well, like people who use serverless, and that 90% of the time boils down to building some kind of um, React or like front-end application that does requests to a backend to do stuff, for example, to fetch data from a database. An API, Lambda, and a database combination would be perfect. From there, API gateway and serverless and Lambda are serverless things. You don't host them, you don't have access to them, you just use them as is. You just know about how scalable they are. essentially. So you can think of that as the main goal. And when it comes to actually building REST APIs or like any endpoints within serverless framework, it is as easy as this line of like a bunch of lines of code. So when I look at the serverless code that does API gateway and function um, deployment, I know that in order for that to happen, I need to specify just a bunch of functions that my controllers, you can think of them as controllers, point them to the correct language specific implementation of that controller. And then the API gateway, as you can see, it's not a separate resource somewhere in this YAML file. It is just these lines saying that a bunch of events should be able to trigger this function. One of them should be an HTTP with protocol HTTP in mind, or HTTPS if you have that. Um, Usually HTTP just because of the SSL termination thing. Um, Request coming to this endpoint, so slash, whatever that might be, and then with method get, and that's it. That's exactly what you need to have in order to build both API gateway resources and function Lambda function. As you can see, again, that's primary goal of having serverless as your framework. If you have most of the code relying on API gateway and Lambda, serverless framework is your choice. And when it comes to actual functions, the only thing to be mindful about is that API gateway resource that you end up creating alongside your function expects from the function a certain way of responding to it, and that way is it expects an object. So API gateway would expect some kind of object, always an object, and that object should have status code and a stringified body. What's inside your body doesn't really um, kind of influence what API gateway does with it. It just needs to be a stringified version or string, and it needs to see what happened. So API gateway should um, respond in a predefined way. And what I mean by predefined is that it will remap back to the front-facing or user-facing side um, with a certain pre-built headers, not necessarily stuff that you provide here, because that's the primary goal of having an API gateway. API gateway is something that stands between a client and a server. You can remap as much as you can. An incoming request remapping, outcoming request remapping, and then back again. Response incoming and response outcoming. Um, the default that AWS gives you usually does most of the setup for you, but for that particular reason, you need to follow certain rules in the code that you are returning to AWS API Gateway. And that's pretty much it. So you'll have to create a bunch of functions that do just basic stuff that you want for them to do, as if you were already building a full-blown Express service with all those middlewares and all that. That's all pre-built for you. And if you run serverless deploys, I did um, few moments ago, you end up with a serverless output, which is just a CloudFormation output. It's a bunch of code that serverless then pushes to CloudFormation. CloudFormation picks it up, creates a stack, which is a visualization for you to see um, what your resources are and what is the state of those resources, to see all the events and all that. And For example, you will be outputting a bunch of stuff. Service endpoint, for example, let's access that, by the way. It should be a simple get endpoint that returns hello world. Go serverless, your function executed successfully, so a bunch of stuff, really useful things, and that's exactly what this was doing. So that is cool. And to say that the output is there, what I need to do is like either read serverless framework documentation for function writing, or just check my output section in my confirmation template. So I assume that would be somewhere down here. Yeah, one of the outputs is bucket name, the other one would be somewhere URL, etc., etc. And that's it. You will be able to click through all the resources that you are creating. So API Gateway REST API is here, and the Hello World Lambda is here. By the way, it might be a bit more complicated in your example, but I'm just showing it as a way of um, giving you a rough idea of what it needs to be doing at the end of the day. And yeah, API gateway looks like this. You can see that it has a get endpoint, and that get endpoint actually maps to your Lambda function. So at some point, yeah, method request maps to the actual Lambda function, and you can even get to that Lambda function. And this place here, so whatever is between your Lambda and this place, and then essentially this, is exactly what is sensitive to Lambda output. So be mindful returning a correct output from Lambda. And Lambda is nothing more than just a function. We can see the entirety of its output. For those people who do TypeScript, you will have built artifacts with a less pretty JavaScript. Uh, and then if you did everything correctly, or if I should say serverless framework did correctly, you will see the actual links specifying your trigger. So for this function, a trigger would be an API gateway, and the destination that it returns nothing else than just API gateway itself. And yeah, you can test your functions using test. If I go here and I will create, I don't know, maybe some kind of tests. Hopefully they fixed the default. And yeah, just hit test and my test succeeded. And I see the raw output of my function instead of API gateway pretty output. Somewhere here, I can test that as well here. In API Gateway to kind of see how API Gateway takes this output and transforms it to its own logic. Following its own logic, I hit test, and yeah, I see that it's prettified, and it was able to pick my status code and response body separately. So that is it. Let's see if we have any questions. So thank you for answers. Okay, couple of more questions. Should we add our product images in task? Up to you, completely up to you. We're not focused on like having that much micromanagement over you. Should we create OpenAI documentation manually or use any serverless plugin? Again, if you know how to, feel free to include one of those plugins to do that. I don't think if the task says otherwise, you should follow that. So it's always rely on what task tells you to do in terms of the outputs. The rest is up to you if you find it really hard to write your own Swagger file or open API thing. Yeah, feel free to include a serverless plugin for that. Again, if you think about it, your serverless YAML should be ideally enough for you to kind of read. So it's your configuration management tool. In production, we tend to build a separate Swagger file to serve somewhere for business people to look into, but from the like infrastructure level, serverless YAML is your central place. It should be clean, nice, and easy to read by default. Should we use REST API or HTTP API? To answer that, I would have to go into too much details of the task itself. Um, Go and read the difference between HTTP API and REST API. There's a difference, and that difference boils down to whatever happens here. Um, Come on, here. So by switching from one type of integration that they called integrations, you would have to read what is a Lambda proxy integration, what is an HTTP integration, and all that. So like I won't spoil you the fun. Let's say that. Okay, we're a bit of out of time, so hopefully that was interesting for you, like, and for people who would be rewatching it. And now, like, the entirety of your task 3 is kind of clear. The only difference is that you will have to make it work with the current setup that you have. So, yep, see you next time, and hopefully